But thank you all for being here today. Yesterday, in preparation for this class, a group from Westminster visited the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum. At the end of the walk through the museum, you enter the Hall of Remembrance, where inscribed in stone above an eternal flame are these words from Deuteronomy. But take care and watch yourselves closely, so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and to your children's children. And then in another space are these words, also from Deuteronomy. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live. Let us begin with a prayer. This is a Shoah memorial prayer. Let us pray. Creator of all, source and shelter, grant a perfect rest under your tabernacle of peace to those who perished in the Holocaust. Our fathers and mothers, our sisters and brothers, our rabbis and teachers, our neighbors and children, the named and the unnamed, whose lives were cut off by brutal, vicious, cunning, and calculated violence. May they find peace in the world to come. Remember the survivors who have since passed away, and the virtues of our people who've died at the hand of malice in every generation. You remember the works of their hands and the messages of their hearts. Put an end to anger, hatred, and fear, and lead us to a time when no one will suffer at the hand of another. Speedily in our days, may the memories of all who faced those horrors be sanctified with joy and love, and may their souls be bound up in the bond of life, a living blessing in our midst. Amen. Amen. Today's presentation is by Betsy Preston, and it's titled Beyond Horror and Shame, Legacies of the Holocaust for Faith Communities and for the Future. Betsy, with that, I'm going to... Are we all set?
No, we're working on it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Betsy.
That looked too nice. So, all right. 2 seconds. All right, technical difficulties are always fun. So while Patrick works to get us connected, I just have to be more interesting by myself, right? Well, thank you all for being here. I said to Jane yesterday that there might be like 5 people here today once people saw what the topic was. So I'm excited that you're all here and that you want to share this difficult topic with us and talk about what does it mean when we talk about the horror, the shame of the Holocaust, the burden that we bear as Christians, as people of faith, inheriting the legacy that we inherited from that time. Even if we were not personally there, there's still a lot to be born and a lot to recognize and witness to from that time. There's also a lot we can learn from that time, and a lot that we want to be aware of, a lot that we want to take away, a lot that we want to move forward with, and a lot that we want to make sure that we're applying those lessons to our own time. And so that's the story that we want to talk about. That's the story that we want to share today. And so parts of it are difficult and hard to talk about, but parts of it we hope to take forward and think about, what does it mean? And why is it still relevant 75 years after the end of the Holocaust? All right. Go, Patrick. Patrick should get the applause.
Took a little while, but we got it. Want me to open up your presentation?
Oh, that'd be great.
Yay.
I think. see if the mouse is strong enough from over here.
Yep.
It's barely, okay. Close enough. All right, so, yeah, so this is what we're talking about. This is where we are. I took a seminar at the Holocaust Museum. I think it was my third recently. I was talking to Dudley before the class started that I'm not related to Holocaust survivors. I don't have a personal connection. My personal connection is more through travel, through study, through personal exposure, and recognizing that when I started thinking about the Holocaust and what that meant when I was in probably high school, it seemed so far away. It seemed so long ago. And it wasn't until I traveled to Central and Eastern Europe and thought about what else is going on in the world that I realized that I was only born 25 years after the Holocaust ended. And despite what happened in those 25 years and the ways that the world changed and the things that made that history seem distant to me, it was not really that distant. And it was worthy of more attention than I had given it before then. And so I think that's part of where my interest in it comes from now. So the class that I took was on was for congregational leaders, whether that be lay leaders in the congregation or people who worked in faith, interfaith areas, things like that in their professions, or pastors and other clergy. And so we had 16 of us and had just really robust and interesting conversations about all of these topics. And we'll focus in on just a couple of them today. But we started off talking about that this is a different story in our history. We heard from the director of the Mandel Center, which is the research center at the Holocaust Museum. And she started off with a very stark statement to us that we've often heard the adage that history is usually written by the winners. And these are not the stories of the winners. And these are unusual stories for us to tell in this way. It's unusual for us to build entire museums around the stories of those who were not the victors. And yet their story does represent a certain victory and a certain commitment from the world when we said never again. But part of this is, what do we mean when we say never again? And what does that mean? So it's important that we tell the stories, that we sit with and live with the horror of the time, the shame that legacy has left us. But at the same time, it's important for us to then to think forward and to think about what that looks like. So if we put this in a little bit of context, the German churches were, most everybody was Christian in European Germany in the early 1900s. Depending on the sources you look at, you can come up with about 95% to about 98%. So the little chart you see there probably shows closer to 97, 98%. But generally, it was considered that about 20 million of the 60 million in Germany were part of the Roman Catholic Church. And the other 40 million were part of the Protestant churches, which were Lutheran, Reformed, or kind of a combination of the two called the United Church. And the Jewish population was less than 500,000, or right around 500,000, which was less than 1%. The other important thing to remember about the German churches, putting them in context, is that the church was an institution of the state. And we often try to look at this and think about this in the only contexts that we know. And we're not accustomed to thinking of the church as an institution of the state. But starting all the way back to the imperial governments, there was a church tax that was collected that continued through the Weimar Republic and on into the National Socialist regime, which was, of course, the Nazi regime. They collected the taxes, they provided the income to churches, and that's where the salaries came from, that's where the program money came from, that's where everything came from. So it's common to hear that the German churches were not known for being protest churches per se. We talked about that last week for those who are here talking about the Barmen Declaration. But it's also true that it was against their interest to be a protest church against the state, even though faith was certainly a part of their life. It was a part of their everyday life. Most were baptized, most were married in the church. Most were blessed their marriages in the church. The German state only recognized civil marriage, but they did have their marriages blessed in the church. They had their children baptized after them. Most had Christian burials. So Christianity was very much a part of the fabric of the life of Germany. But it was not separated from the civic institutions the way we think of today. We did have a little bit later into the war, into the difficult times in Germany, the Confessing Church, which was where the Barmen Declaration came from. And that was a group within the Protestant churches that said, whoa, something's not right. We don't agree with what the state's doing. We should really be talking about this differently. The thing that really triggered that for them was the policy that became known for euthanasia against disabled and terminally ill persons. It was not so much what was going on in the religious arena, what was going on against the Jewish people. What really started that off was looking at, they called it the T4 rules laws, and thinking about that, whoa, we're taking out German citizens here, and that's different. But in the meantime, we've come a long way from recognizing fellow people of faith in the Jewish community, and looking at the Jewish community as a race and not another community of faith. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So really there was a lot more concern about this policy for euthanasia, about the policies for eliminating the Roma, the wandering gypsies, for eliminating other undesirables of society who were still accorded German citizenship. But the faith-based piece of it was not as prominent in the resistance from the church as we would probably want it to be, and as we would probably think of it being. So it really became in that context that the Jewish question, as we've heard it termed, became a question of race. It was presented very much as a question of race when policies were issued, when rights were taken away. And the National Socialism ideology was based on the idea of a superior race, and that we needed a superior race to procreate, to build a better society, and we needed more space for that race. And those two philosophies kind of converged in a really bad way, ultimately. So the Nazis didn't care for other political movements. Marxism, communism, pacifism, internationalism, all of those things they considered to be anti-nationalist, and really felt like that just, that along with physical defects were, those thought processes were a blemish on the society and the master race that they were trying to create. So that was kind of the context in which the churches were operating. So what I thought we would do first is talk a little bit about what I would call the othering of the Jews. And how did we get to a place where it was acceptable to think about a certain group of people as so far other from us, so far removed from us, that it's okay to treat them like this, that we're willing to go along with what's going on in this way. And this particular conversation, we're really looking at just the faith lens. Obviously, there's a lot more that all played together in order to enable such a horrific event in our history, in our world history. But certainly, as we look at it from the faith lens today, 75 years later, a part of this is to look back and to say, how did it get to a point where persons who would think of themselves as persons of good conscience could turn around and say, well, those people are so different. It's okay. You know, we don't need to worry about how this is going. Sensitive on the mouse there. So I can't cover 2,500 years of history in 15 minutes, as much as I might like to try. So I'm going to hit a few highlights here. And I don't want you to think so much about exactly every detail of what I talk about. It's more a process. It's more, how is it that over centuries, over millennia, we developed this thinking collectively, we being the highest echelons of world society, that the rest of us who considered ourselves ordinary people could just go along. That as rights are slowly taken away, as treatment of people is slowly changed, you know, the frog in the pot boils. And so I want you to think more about the process than the actual details. Those of you who are Hamilton fans, if you think about, you know, in the room where it happened, if you can put yourself in the room where it happened, looking down from 50,000 feet into just a few of these milestones, just a few of these exhibits of what kind of happened through the centuries, to think about how we got where we got. So we'll start with kind of 500 years of history on our timeline here, that we all hung out together as biblical Israel, and we were one people. And then there was the Babylonian exile, and we, you know, drifted away from the homeland, from the lands that we felt that had been given to us by right, by faith. And so we're being considered a wandering people at that point. And then we reached the time of the Common Era. And that, of course, was with the birth of Christ, is the approximate dating of that beginning of the Common Era. And the crucifixion of Christ was was around 30 in the Common Era. And so this is where we begin to see that now we have Jewish faith and Jewish people, and we have people who are saying, we think there's more, and we think there's something else that, you know, we think that the fulfillment of the prophecy is here. And so the question becomes then, you know, who carries the faith tradition forward? Who does it belong to? And so we kind of start out with sort of a little familial sibling rivalry on the playground. And kind of have Jewish folks on the one hand saying that, yeah, you know, we are the continuation of the Abrahamic tradition, and the covenant that was forged between God and Abraham continued through the patriarchs, matriarchs. Everybody else came to fuller realization through Moses, flows organically from the time of the priests, the kings and the prophets, all the way through the rabbinic sages into our own time. Then underneath that, we have sort of a developing Christian view in the early centuries that kind of said, no, hold on here. You know, we all started together as Israelite religion, but now the continuation of that is Christianity. And as, you know, you all over here in Judaism didn't get with the program. You all didn't quite catch on that, you know, the fulfillment of the prophecy is here. The fulfillment of the law is here. And so we are the continuation of the covenant of the Abrahamic faith. And you all are now the ones who split out over here. That's an oversimplification, obviously, as everything in this 15-minute recap will be. But that's kind of where we started, was to kind of say, you know, who does this really belong to? You know, is it yours? Is it mine? For people watching from the outside, the Gentiles, you know, if they want to join one group or the other, which one is the true faith? In actuality, scholarship today, in the recent decades, looks at this more not as a parent-child relationship, as who started up here and got the continuation of the lineage, but more as a true sibling rivalry, punching on the playground and looking at, who is, that we really just have two traditions that have flowed out from the same origin. A lot of that came about with the destruction of the Second Temple, which happened around 70 Common Era time. And so there were a lot of things that changed in Judaism at that time. And so there were a lot of things that were adopted by Christianity and adapted by Christianity from some of the changes that came into the Jewish faith. Without kind of that national gathering place for faith, even if they couldn't go there, if they were part of the exiled population, they still knew that it was there and it was kind of the focus. And you had the priests in the temple. And and the priests kind of came by that by birthright. And so suddenly you have no place for people to be as a national place to gather together. And so you start looking at how else do you spread your faith? How else do you teach your faith? How else do you get people together in faith? And so, the oral Torah began to be more of a piece of what was going on here, oral tradition as opposed to just the written scrolls. People learned parts of the Torah, as they still do today, that they shared in their homes. The table fellowship in their homes became much more of the gathering space rather than the temple itself. It became much more the focus for the gathering space rather than the temple itself. And then finally, the rabbinate developed. And instead of just having priests who really by their birthright or their pedigree became ascended to the priesthood, now we have any male Jew who can become a rabbi simply by mastering the traditions and really showing their dedication and their devotion, which obviously took years of study and so forth. It was not a simple matter, but it certainly was a more democratic and open matter than it once had been. So followers of Jesus picked up a lot of these same changes and traditions, established them as traditions. They sought understanding from the only scriptures they knew, which were the Hebrew scriptures. Looking backward into the Hebrew scriptures was easier for them to define and give heft to the new developing faith as an interpretation and a fulfillment of the scriptures that were already being supported in the Jewish community. But they too were then looking for, where if we don't have a temple, then what else do we do? And this faith also became much more of a gathering and household-based faith. There was a redefinition of communal boundaries. Suddenly, just as the rabbinic tradition had opened up from the priesthood, the Jews who followed Jesus and their folks who came after them, Paul being most notable as the first, and then many others after, really wrestled with, who do we let in? Do they have to follow the old law like we did? Do they move on to something else? And so there was a lot of concern there. Just as the priests were saying, who do we let into the priesthood? The Christians were saying, who do we let into this practice? And what do they have to do to be part of our family? And so there was a lot of discussion there. And finally, the Christians were reformulating monotheism. And while they wanted to continue with monotheism and the understanding of that from the Hebrew scripture, one God, they also were seeing Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of that. And so they had to really work out the rich language that we still develop today on, what does it mean to have Jesus Christ as a living, walking Jewish person of God? And how do we define that? So there was a whole lot going on, if I go back to our timeline, in kind of that 200-ish years there between the Temple of Destruction and the Roman government's endorsement and adoption of the Christian faith for society. And so there was a whole lot going on of who's right, how do we define ourselves in both traditions. And then in 312, Constantine became a patron of the Christian church. And that all of a sudden kind of elevated this playground rivalry a little bit. And it was like, Dad came in and said, all right, yeah, you guys have been digging this out, but really your sister's kind of more right. And so settle it up and go with what your sister wants. And so Constantine came in, and I know somebody drew our attention in the class to an article that reimagined and said, what if Constantine had converted to Judaism? And so, wouldn't our world history be different? Which was an interesting discussion and an interesting imagining. But Constantine did not convert to Judaism. He converted to Christianity, and really pushed that as an instrument of the state in ancient Rome. So once we kind of had an endorsement to say, all right, we think one's a little better than the other, then we kind of had to get to the next step to say, so what does that mean? How do the two faiths relate to each other? And where do we go from there? Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, was kind of the first person to step out and lay a cornerstone for new relationships between Jews and Christians. Up until then, a lot of this playground duking it out was to try to figure out if the Jews were wrong from the Christian perspective, then the only way to fix that is for Jews to convert. And there's plenty of scripture that one can point to and one can reinterpret from a New Testament perspective that says, that one can look at and point to and say, that was how it was supposed to be. Faustus was one philosopher theologian who was really a proponent of that. For those of you who are students of history, there were others. And Augustine kind of came in, and looking at his perspective from our perspective, we say, oh, that was kind of, I'm not sure how he got there. But what he did was to say that no, Jews are necessary to the Christian faith, that there's a piece of Judaism that will always be a part of Christianity, and that it's necessary for us to be together. He liked that we elevated Christianity over Judaism as an element of the state, but he said, but it doesn't mean that all Jews have to convert, and it doesn't mean that all Jews are, in the wrong place. Now, he had kind of an interesting philosophy around that. And he said that Jews were the book bearers. Jews were the bringers of the word, and that Jews were the ones who were keeping the Torah, who were, of course, learning the oral tradition, and that was a necessary first step for Christians, that we needed somebody who was bringing that along and helping us to verify the tradition from which we came. In his present of 400-ish Common Era, then he took that a step to the next step and said, but even though they're the book bearers, and even though they're giving us this legitimacy of the word, there's still kind of a negative reinforcement of our positive faith. And so he said that when we look at all of what they're bringing to us and we say, yeah, but you got it wrong. And so he looked at that as kind of necessary for Christians to move forward. And he said, if the Jews are there and are testifying to the validity of the Hebrew scripture, and the Jews are there talking about the tradition that we come from, then that lends a certain heft and gravity to where we are today. But at the same time, we want to recognize that, the Jews are in exile, that we think that there's a different way forward, And so then we point to the Jews and we say, no, it's necessary for you to be there to shore up who we are, but you still don't have it right. He also believed that the second coming, the end of history, it was still necessary for there to be a people of Jewish faith, that was part of what was necessary for the final fulfillment of the law. So this was kind of his three-tiered, in 2 minutes or less, his three-tiered philosophy. He wrote about 4 books on it that apparently had a fair amount of heft to them. But that was the summary of what it was. And that, we have the Jews are in exile, the Jews are the keepers of the books, and the Jews bring the testimony to the Christian faith that puts the Christian faith where it is today. Today being 400 Common Era. So he was the first one who said, no, we don't have to convert all the Jews. The Jews have a place in world history. The Jews have a place in faith history. We still see that in our interfaith relations today. We didn't get to that campground on the same bus. We definitely have different ways of looking at the reasons that we believe in a multicultural faith that are both cultural and faith-based in our community of America in 2024. So we certainly look at this from 2,000 years ago and say, okay, that's an interesting philosophy. But still, he was the first one to kind of lay it out and say, nope, I think there is a place for everybody. So if we slide our timeline on over, we've kind of moved now from, a rival other to a necessary other from Augustine. And now as we move on through the Middle Ages, his philosophy kind of lasted for hundreds of years in the religious arena. But we had a lot of other things going on in the cultural arena. We had, in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, later Middle Ages, anybody want to take a stab at kind of what was going on in the culture then? The Reformation, that was a big one. Yeah, Luther had some interesting ideas about the Jews too, that kind of flowed from Augustine's philosophy. Yeah, so the Reformation was a big one. Yeah, other things? Our world history scholars are quiet. Yeah.
The Crusades.
The Crusades, yes, that's a big one. Yeah. So early in the Middle Ages, as we've had Christianity now declared the official religion of the empire, began to bring about some legal troubles for the Jews. There were certain vocations that were restricted, certain economic restrictions, intermarriage was restricted. So a lot of different things are kind of starting through this little period of 500 years or so here that we don't really see a whole lot, but then absolutely, we slide this on over and we get to the Crusades. And so we really spent a lot of time, a couple hundred years there, wanting to destroy the infidel. And so folks set out on the Crusades, looking to destroy primarily the Muslim infidel. But along the way, they found an awful lot of European Jewish communities. And the prevailing philosophy was kind of, well, these are infidel communities too. And so there was a whole lot of destruction in the name of faith that was kind of difficult to work with. So we've got that going on in the culture, kind of
Which period is what we call the Dark Ages?
the Middle Ages.
I mean, the whole time, or?
I would say the first half. So probably this half would be the Dark Ages.
Okay.
And what we would call
So before the Crusades and the Reformation and all that.
right, kind of the late antiquity, early Middle
Yeah.
Ages. Yeah, it
Okay.
would be the Dark Ages. And then you have kind of the high Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, that move on kind of toward the Reformation, toward other things where people are thinking differently. But it took a long time to get there. So we have that, Augustine says, well, conveniently, Jews are religiously different from us and providing kind of a foil for us. So that makes them kind of conveniently unbelievers for religious philosophy for this period. Jews also became the bankers during this period. If any of you remember some of that history, that during that time, the Christians were, based on a number of scriptures, Exodus, Deuteronomy, were forbidden from lending money and felt like that was a dirty trade, and that the Bible was instructing them not to lend money at interest. And that was the phrase on which it really turned, was that Christians shouldn't lend money at interest. And so if you're not lending money at interest, then you're not really having a lot of incentive to lend your money and grow your money. And so that kind of fell to the Jews. The Jewish community said, yeah, we can lend money. We'll charge you interest for it, but we'll lend you money. So the Jews became associated with the money lending and the money trade and kind of the dirty side of the money trade, rightly or wrongly. So there was kind of this accusation, this libel almost, of Jews charging excessive interest, of money hoarding, of a lot of these tropes and stereotypes that persist through the modern age. Conveniently, agents of evil. We also had kind of I'm not sure I can pull it up from here. So I'm not sure how well you can see, but the picture here is a fairly famous one that was created, I think, about 300 or 400 years after the Black Death, actually. But it's a picture of the doctors and what they wore during the Black Death, and was actually their medical costume. And it kind of, when you're looking at the small version of it, it almost looks like cartoon caricatures of Jewish persons. And some of those caricatures may have actually started with something like this. But they wore a metal tin contraption that they could pack herbs and other things into the nose of it to kind of serve as a respirator and keep them a little bit safer. And then they had this whole costume of, trying to protect themselves from the Black Death if the doctors actually went to visit the patients. And so this became something else that the Jews were associated with. Anybody have any idea why Jews might have suffered fewer deaths from the plague than other people did?
They have strong sanitary traditions.
That's one. You got it, Prue. Okay. Yeah, so the Jews were asked to live primarily together, sometimes by choice, sometimes not by choice. And that was the earliest termination of the Jewish ghetto. They were known as the ghetto communities. And so later that became associated with World War II terminology, and that the ghettos were where we really segregated folks away. But the early usage of the term was just in the community sense. So the Jews lived primarily in insulated communities. Again, that facilitated kind of their neighborhood gathering way of approaching what they did. And so there was a lot of business went on in the same community. So the communities were more isolated. And then kosher food preparation was probably better than most food preparation. Ritual ablution, can't ever say that word, but that they were better at taking care of themselves in a time when people weren't always focused on germs and baths and really keeping themselves clean. And so because of some of the ritual of the religion, the Jewish communities did a better job of that. And their burial practices. The Jewish tradition, even today, folks are typically buried in a quicker tradition than what we might have. And so all of those things contributed to a lower death rate in the Jewish community. But that kind of pushed them off to the edge that, what are these people really doing? How come everybody else is getting more sick and these people aren't? And they kind of became these convenient agents of evil. And there was a philosophy or a theory that Jews were poisoning the wells of everybody else so that everybody else was dying and the Jews weren't dying, and it was their revenge. which of course we know better today from medical perspective, from sanitary perspective, from all of these things, better food preparation. But at the time, it was yet another way that we kind of said, we're going to push these, more convenient ways that we really don't feel like these people are a part of mainstream Christian Roman imperial society and the other imperial governments that followed, and said, all of these things, we're just going to kind of push them off. Finances, medical things, all of it, we don't trust where we are. So going on from there, kind of a turning point. So there was more of that going on for a few more years, a couple hundred more years. And then we start moving into the age of the Enlightenment. So Marty, that's where we start moving kind of from the higher Middle Ages on into more of our modern times. The age of the Enlightenment, we see there started just before the 1700s, which is pretty young history in this country, but pretty old history still in the European continents. And so as people started thinking more and more about the Enlightenment as a time of thinking through science and philosophy and other things that were taking on their attention and their time, and they kind of began to shift away from a faith identity to a science and knowing identity, from a God-given and revealed person-centered thing to rationality, and saying, well, if we can't rationalize it, if we can't prove it, then maybe that's not where we want to be. And so Jews, again, didn't really fit that. The Jews followed their traditions very closely. They still lived often together. They were considered to be kind of tribalistic in that regard. They followed the Torah as opposed to following the new science of the Enlightenment age. And so again, they were just kind of looked at as, well, you're still other, you're still doing something different, but you really, okay, we don't feel like we need you anymore from the religious perspective. We don't need you to justify who we are. We're a much more mature faith now. And so it's just kind of, all right, you can assimilate, you can stay secular, you can be part of the liberal reforms, you can convert, you can not convert, whatever you want to do. And the prevailing thought was, of course, more people were falling away from the Christian church at that point, feeling like rational thought was taking it over. But either way, Jews kind of became unnecessary to the mainstream society and unnecessary to the narrative of the Christian faith at that point. As we get to the very modern age of 1900 and beyond, which starts to feel further and further away as we get further into 2000 and beyond. But then we started to get into the real science of Darwinism and the very well justified science, many would say, of selection of the species and other things. But then people started unscientifically applying that to humans and saying that, there's that science was something they could convert over to humans. From that flowed hierarchies of race, orders of creation, that even if you convert, that you still are who you were created to be, and even baptism doesn't erase that, which was a pretty radical thing compared to where we sit today. So it really was kind of standing in the way of some of the utopias that people were starting to envision and thinking that they actually could create, if they could just get these people out of the way that they weren't all that excited about. And so that's kind of where we got to be, that's your 20-minute tour of how did we get to where we got to be. So I put it kind of in this little graphic for you, but we started out as one people of faith, Abrahamic faith, obviously. And then as Christianity diverged, we kind of moved into this sibling rivalry, duking it out on the playground, who's right, who's wrong, until Constantine came along and said, oh, well, I think the Christians are right. I'm converting to Christianity. And so that's now the religion of the state. So then all of a sudden we began to develop these philosophies of Jews as a necessary evil. Then we had kind of the convenient other, where we kind of said, okay, we don't have as much need for justification from you, but there's still plenty of things that we can kind of blame on the Jews. The unnecessary evil or unnecessary other that we talked about, until finally we kind of get to Nazi socialism and we say toxic evil, toxic other, that this was where they began to say it's an unwanted other. It's a toxic other. It's destroying our society. It's destroying who we want to be, who we think we are. And it's time to move on from that. So as I said at the beginning of this little skip through history, what I want you to take from this is not so much the historical detail. There are many things that could be added into that. There are probably things that could be removed from that, different priorities you could put on that, just a few highlights that I gave you. But really what's important is the arc of it and how we started from this circle together and we kept pushing this people of faith further and further and further away until you can see the circles running off the screen and we've developed this idea of a toxic other. And it was pretty widely accepted that, we just kind of slowly over centuries decided that this was not gelling with where society was, and that the Jews, in holding on to their faith and holding on to their identity, were just not keeping up with the times. And so I encourage you to think about that process and kind of think about that arc and think about, where are we in terms of othering today? The Jews are not the only ones who've been othered in history. And they're not the only ones who are still othered as we enter the 21st century. So, where are we in that? Where do we show up in that conversation, in our interactions with other people, in the way that we talk to other people, the conversations that we choose to have, and who is that other? And so as persons of faith, as we think about kind of this process of pushing this one group further and further to the edge in a way that allowed some pretty atrocious things to happen. The real thing to take away from it is not so much the step-by-step history, but how did we get there? And are we still doing that in other ways today? And so I'd encourage you to think about that.
Where
Yeah.
where does the institution of marriage fit into that scheme? Beginning.
At the beginning, the institution of marriage, that's a good question. I'm not certain where in those different centuries it was more a blessing of the state and where it was more a blessing of the church. I think in the earliest years, it was more a blessing of the church. And then it's kind of shifted back and forth. Anne, do you know more about that? Okay. I'll see if I can find that out. We'll get back to you. But I would be speaking from ignorance if I tried to answer that question.
Isn't this othering process propagated by Christian theology in requiring salvation? Don't get salvation, you get damned to some place you don't want to be. That's about as othering as you can get.
It is.
For eternity, you are othered.
Yes.
If you aren't saved, and somehow we've got to get off this merry-go-round and recognize that everybody in the world is one family, and break down the walls and build bridges instead, or we're all gonna wind up killing each other, as we are doing now.
You're giving me a great segue to where I want to spend the last part of our time together. About 5 minutes, okay? So I'll flip through this somewhat quickly. But part of what we can do in the wake of the Holocaust is to frame that discussion, exactly as the judge brought up. You know, how are we discussing Christianity in the post-Holocaust world? And particularly, how are we representing Jews and Judaism or other groups of others in our conversations within Christianity? And are we making more room for that or making less room for that? What's our ethical responsibility? In a world that's limited by systems, you know, this is a place where we feel that our institutions failed us by the time we got to 1940. We feel that the state failed us, the civic institution. We feel that the church failed us, our faith institution, the universities failed us, our educational institutions. All were silent, by and large. There were exceptions, but certainly we're speaking, you know, it took complicity of all of those or institutions and more to the judicial system to really make space for this event to happen. And there were many other contributors. We're looking particularly through the faith lens right now. Certainly some were in the discussion yesterday of, you know, without the fog of war, this probably couldn't have happened. That, you know, there were a number of other sociological and civic factors that contributed to this. But when we look at it as people of faith and we say, you know, where were we? Where were the Christians that were 98% of the population in Germany? You know, in a world of institutions and systems and how we organize ourselves as people, how much can we do as individuals? How do we influence those systems as individuals? I don't have a lot of answers for you, but I have a couple. Part of that is what we call radical hospitality, and thinking of it as hospitality of not necessarily being the settled host. When I bring a host into, you know, when I host a gathering or a dinner, and I know exactly what I want the evening to look like, and I'm making everybody welcome and I'm getting everybody on board, and you know, that we're not necessarily being the settled host. We're being the ones who are being asked to go out, to look for where there's a need, a welcome, a space for us to be vulnerable, a space for us to engage with the others, as well as to then come back into our own community and talk about what we've learned and talk about where we are and how we want to show up in our faith conversations. To that end, I think that Westminster has made some good starts. You know, I have here on the screen the statement from the Therefore Committee, which was the predecessor of our Faith and Race Initiative now, where we spoke publicly and said that we believe as a congregation that everyone is created in the image of God, and that we want to respect and strengthen the diversity of viewpoints and perspectives within our own community. Over the course of this year in adult education, we're looking at creeds and how we make a statement of faith for ourselves. And last week, the piece that we looked at alongside the Barman Confession was our statement as a group of adult ed people at Westminster to say that we are all beloved children of God. And in the tradition of Barman, Jacob and Scott broke that down for us to say, you know, the things that we affirm as a part of that statement, that we affirm every person as a beloved child of God, exactly as the judge is bringing up here, that we affirm that all people bear God's image and possess inherent worth. And we reject messages that employ dehumanizing rhetoric and attempt to restrict who is worthy of God's love. And I think it's easy sometimes in this context to think of our Christian community as the beloved children of God, but we challenge ourselves to also think of the other the other faith traditions and the other people who we other, and to think of, what does it mean to say that Christ removed restrictions on loving your neighbor. And so what does it mean for us to show up in that way? So back to radical hospitality. A lot of this is to consider, where are the inhospitalities? Where should we extend hospitality? Where do we see the need for hospitality or respond to hospitality from others as they reach out to us in their moments of vulnerability? It's important that we build the networks and we practice the hospitality before the crisis arrives. If we don't have the networks to reach out across, and we don't have the vocabulary and the tools for conversation, then showing up in the moment of crisis is not going to be the time to try to develop those structures. And so as persons of faith, as persons who are parts of institution, all the way from our congregational size to the Presbyterian Church writ large, it's on us to try to do that. So in closing, I would say, when trauma leads to dysfunction, and you can't jettison that legacy, we'll never jettison the legacy of the Holocaust. And the argument is that we shouldn't want to. We should want to learn from this history. We should want to learn from what it is that happened and how did it happen. And so we really want to recognize that the trauma will always be there between the world and the Jews, in the various ways that the world shows up and is represented, and between Christians and Jews. We didn't show up when we should have, and that's a legacy that we have to own. But it's also a legacy of realizing what is possible for us as human beings, as humans who can't get rid of our systems in which we have to organize ourselves, all several million of us around the world. How do we work within those systems? How do we move past those systems in order to affect change? And how do we learn to navigate, to function, and to live in the system with ourselves and with each other?
Thank you.
I think I'll leave it there.